Site speed is incredibly important because it affects user experience. User experience affects conversions, and conversions affects everything else. In theory, there's only 3 ways that you can speed up your site, and I'm going to be explaining how to diagnose them, what to look for, and the potential remedies. This is not a technical video, so you don't need to code, none of that. Some of the tricky elements, you may actually need to hire a developer, but I promise you, understanding why these things occur and the context behind it is going to make it 100% to find and hire the appropriate person. My name is Isaac, previous CTO and tech lead of a 500 million D2C brand. Web services at a high level really only have 2 components. You have the server and the client. The server is the thing that lives in the sky. It's where all the data lives. It's your Shopify. The client is the thing you use to access the website. So the phone, the tablet, the laptop. The server you can ignore for now. It's kind of out of the scope of this video. However, the client is completely our responsibility. In a nutshell, you make a request to the server and the server sends a bunch of the files to the client and the client just renders them. When the server sends the bundle of files or assets to the client, some of them load a lot faster than others. So for example, the HTML and CSS, they're just text files. Your browser turns that into visual things on the screen. The thing that normally takes longer is the JavaScript, which is the code that executes images, video, bigger assets like that. This is important to know because generally your browser prioritizes certain things to load before others. So for example, the HTML and CSS are normally the first things to load, which is why when you check a website, often you can see the title and the text, but maybe no images, or maybe, none of the fancy animations have happened. JavaScript fires afterwards and images load afterwards, and it's important because it's sort of a priority order. You can change the order things execute on the browser, but that can also become a problem because you can have things called render blocking assets, which means the render doesn't happen until something's loaded. Important, we're going to get to that. I said all that to say this: there are 3 areas that affect site speed: how long things take to load, when they load, and first user interaction. Number 1, how long things take to load, which is kind of the most obvious one. This is all the big files, the big images, the videos, the JavaScript. I'm going to do a quick video to show you how you can diagnose on browsers what network requests look like, and it will help you visualize a little bit on how long things are taking. I am on the Represent website right now. If you right click and go and inspect element and then go to network, you're going to hit record at the top and then just refresh the page. And then after a bit, you want to stop record or just keep going forever. Well, not forever, but for what we want to see. Okay, now this is really cool because you can see all the network requests that have happened. You can also see when they've happened. You can organize things by how long they take to load. So if I look at everything, pixel, visually, okay, looks like they're using visually AI. That's the thing that's taking the longest to load. And this is probably like a JavaScript thing or, okay, it's like, so they're TikTok. But you can start looking at how long things are actually taking, and obviously this is going to affect the speed of the website. What is really cool as well is you can also look at when things load. So if I make this timeline a little bit shorter and I move it to, not that short, if I move it to the beginning, you can see like the first things to load and how long they took. UTM. This looks like a Google Ads thing, which is probably important for where the traffic came from, whatever. Yeah, the things here are a lot quicker to load at the beginning. And as you sort of start expanding it out, more stuff comes up. You can then check, whether it's network requests, which are normally, okay, how later on I will talk about having like a cart, JS and stuff like that. This is what I'm talking about. You've got different scripts from Shopify that are being called in. You can check for docs, CSS, images as well. That's pretty important. So for example, the mobile banner, that should be one of the first thing that loads. Yeah, that's like the first thing that loads, which is perfect. You want that to load because it's the first thing you see. And if you want, you can then go through the journey and see like when images come through and where. A little bit technical, but it just means if you're suspicious about something or want to understand how things are being loaded and what's taking the most time, this is a really good way to do it. You can also use Google Page Insights. High quality images are important, but they are only as important as screen size. So if you are on your browser, you can right click and go and inspect element, and you can actually check how big the image is. Google page speed will also tell you something similar, but sometimes people render images that are actually far bigger than the screen that they're actually rendered on. And what that basically means is you've got maybe 4,000 pixels worth of image, but you've only got 1,000 pixels worth of desktop space, which means you're downloading 300 3,000 pixels you're not even going to use. Most themes have a built-in image sizer on their like image banners, stuff like that, so it should do it for you. However, you can also crop images directly on Shopify. There's an editor that lets you do it. So if you know the max, page width someone's going to have, or based on, your website is limited to a certain amount of pixels, you never need an image to be wider than that. And doing this means that it's going to be easier to download, it's going to be easier to render for your browser. JavaScript is a little bit trickier, and obviously you probably need someone that does have some technical experience to help you with this. But you can check for files that are called anything that has .js. That's a script file. The normal ones that you'll see like main.js and global.js. And these, in theory, are rendered on every page. However, you should look to see if you can find stuff like cart.js, you can find like animations.js. The more individual elements that are coming from your Shopify is good, because it means your code is split into multiple assets which can be rendered based on when they're needed. So for example, if the only thing you ever see is a main.js and a global.js, it means all the code from your website is in one big asset, and then every time that's got to be sent to the browser. What's actually better is if you can split it up into smaller assets. Again, you probably need a coder for this, but just an example. Number 2, when things load. It's easy to think that the load speed is all that matters. And in a way, if there was zero load speed, yeah, it would be all that mattered. However, as we saw in the previous tab, things actually have a queue when they download. So some resources load before others can start, and that's purely just based on the amount of information your client can receive at any one time. So for example, if you had 10 scripts which take 0.5 seconds to load, it's really not bad. However, if they go one after the other, that takes 5 seconds, and no user is waiting 5 seconds for a website. This normally, when you see it on the inspection tab, is caused by network requests. So what happens is sometimes the JavaScript will load on your website that comes from the server, but then the JavaScript might actually need to get information from an external source. So you ask the server for information, it gives you the JavaScript file, your browser reads it and says, oh, I now need to get information from somewhere else, makes another network request, and then you have to wait for that one to come back. In particular on Shopify, I see this happen with third-party apps. You will have another app integrated, and to use this app's actual functionality, it needs to request its server to get back, I don't know, like customer recommendations or something for accounts or something like that. I work with a pretty big client who uses a lot of apps, and we're actually starting to move away from them a little bit, because having so many apps, we're deliberately putting in the code a wait request. So we have to wait for the app to download the information it needs for us to then render the page or show something to the user. And if you've only got 1 or 2 of these apps to do it, it's not a big deal. But as you start offsetting, if you've got an app that handles your merchandising and all your product recommendations, you got one that handles your accounts, maybe one for your cart, over time, there can be a lot of things and they add up. This is a difficult one on giving a straight answer on how to fix. It's probably going to be the one where you need the most dev advice to diagnose. But it's important to understand that the more resources you have on the site, it's the hog for the bandwidth. And that even though some things might not actually load that slowly, they're now going to be put in a queue. And the more things on your website, the bigger the queue gets. What's important is making sure that they're not render blocking, which I'm going to get to in the next step. Number 3, first user interaction. This one's kind of interesting. It sort of amplifies the last one, but also contradicts the last 2. So whereas previously we've been looking at the technicals of how something can load faster, fundamentally it's to boost performance, which is based on experience, and it's humans experiencing it, which means it's highly susceptible to bias and interpretation. So as I mentioned before, when you can load things at different times, what's not important is that everything loads at once. It's important that things look like they load at once. Or potentially more accurately, the user doesn't care what isn't loaded. So for example, if I load a website and we see the banner, the title, the subtitles, and then there's a bunch of content below, the user's going to care a lot if we don't render the top banner and then we got no title and the page is just blank for 2 seconds. However, the user really isn't going to care, and they probably won't even know if we don't render anything below the fold and we only render the top elements first. This is where it gets a little bit technical. Although this point's not technical, these 2 things a little bit iffy, so bear with me. The 2 concepts that you should be super aware of for this are lazy loading and deferred loading. Deferred loading means you don't actually load something until later. So for example, if there is a less important resource, so something that's like lower down on the page, or maybe a script that fires and then does something in the background that the user isn't really going to notice for the first few seconds anyway, defer it. That should not be blocking the queue. That should be done once everything else is done. And then secondly, lazy loading. And this is normally when you use a lower quality resource, which is faster to download, and then fetch the higher quality resource later once there's more availability in the queue. So for example, if you've ever been on a website and there's like a low res image and after a few seconds it then becomes high res, Users generally are quite forgiving if they already see the resource, but it's maybe not the highest quality version. They think, oh, it takes time to load. For some reason, people do not think the same way if there's no resource there. They're like, oh, it's slow. Whereas if it loads in segments, maybe because it just like gives them something at first to see, they're more forgiving. I don't know how it works. So you probably will need someone technical to actually help you set up how to defer scripts and how to lazy load. There's some apps out there for lazy loading, like image caching, stuff like that. But I think it's really important that you can understand and think about what things are and aren't important. So, if you've got like cart recommendations, do they need to be loading immediately as soon as the user opens the website? We've got to wait for them to click the cart anyway. So as you start thinking like this, you can start communicating with the developers. They're not always the smartest when it comes to the user experience. So if you can help them with that, they will handle the technical. So in summary, there's 3 ways that you can improve the site speed. One is the speed that things actually load, and that's by decreasing script size and making sure there's less things on your website. The order in which they load, which again, probably a little bit more to do with third-party stuff and making sure you don't have too many external dependencies and the stuff on your website. And number 3, prioritize user interaction, which is kind of just using the first 2 things, but making sure that, it's more optimized for experience. I hope that was useful. If you have any tips, suggestions, or you think there's anything I missed out, let me know. Would love to hear about it in the comments.